But now what I'm asking for is a piece of ice, cold and poorly located, that can play a vital role in world peace and world protection. It's a very small ask compared to what we have given them for many, many decades. But the problem with NATO is that we'll be there for them 100%. But I'm not sure that they'd be there for us. If we gave them the call, gentlemen, we are being attacked. We're under attack by such and such a nation. I know them all very well. I'm not sure that they'd be there.
Donald Trump just stood on one of the world's most influential stages and made a statement that immediately sent diplomats, investors, and allies into quiet recalculation. He said the United States wants Greenland. He said negotiations should begin immediately. And then he added something that changed the entire tone of the moment. He said he would not use force. At first glance, that may sound reassuring. But when you listen carefully to what was said, and just as importantly, how it was said, a far more complex picture begins to emerge. Because this wasn't just a speech about territory. It wasn't just about diplomacy. And it definitely wasn't just a rhetorical moment in Davos. What happened on that stage revealed how power is being framed, how alliances are being tested, and why Greenland has quietly become one of the most strategically sensitive places on the planet. And the most important part of this story isn't the headline, it's what comes after it. The moment everyone focused on, and the part many missed, the World Economic Forum in Davos, is usually where leaders talk in carefully polished language. Big themes, long-term visions, predictable phrases. But this time, the tone shifted. President Trump publicly called for immediate negotiations, for the United States to acquire Greenland from Denmark, a NATO ally, framing the island as essential to U.S. and international security. At the same time, he made a clear point of saying he would not use force to make it happen. That distinction matters, because while the rejection of force lowers immediate tension, the surrounding language raised new questions, especially for European leaders who were listening closely in the room. Trump described Greenland as part of North America. He framed US 26. Interest as protective rather than aggressive. And he suggested that allies should not stand in the way of what he sees as a strategic necessity. None of that violates international law on its own, but taken together, it signals a shift in how power and persuasion are being communicated. And that's where this story actually begins. This isn't the first time Trump has raised the idea of acquiring Greenland. But the timing now is different. Greenland sits at the crossroads of the Arctic, North America, and Europe. As ice patterns change and global shipping routes evolve, the region is becoming more accessible and more strategically relevant. Publicly available analyses have long noted Greenland's importance for Arctic monitoring, early warning systems, transatlantic defense positioning. Trump emphasized security repeatedly, stating that the island matters not for resources, but for what he called strategic national and international security. Whether experts agree with that framing is debated. What matters is that the argument is being made openly, on a global stage, and directed not just at Denmark, but at NATO as a whole. That alone makes this moment different from past comments. One line from the speech stood out to many observers. Trump suggested that allies could agree to negotiations, and we'll be very appreciative, or refuse, in which case he added, we will remember. That phrasing was not a threat in the traditional sense. There was no call to action, no announcement of consequences. But in diplomatic language, memory implies leverage. And that's why several European officials reportedly viewed the comment as a signal, not of immediate conflict, but of future recalibration in alliances, trade discussions, and defense expectations. This is where the story shifts from Greenland itself to something larger. Because Greenland may be the subject, but alliance dynamics are the stakes. Why Davos was the perfect place to say this Davos isn't just a conference. It's a room full of people who influence markets, policies, and long-term planning. By raising Greenland there, Trump wasn't speaking only to governments. He was speaking to investors, defense planners, energy analysts, and corporate leaders who think in decades, not election cycles. The message was simple, even if the implications were not. The United States sees the Arctic as central to its future role, and it expects allies to adjust accordingly. That expectation, more than the idea of a territorial transfer, is what caused unease among European leaders present at the forum. Because adjusting expectations is often where alliances begin to strain. Official responses from European leaders were measured. Publicly, many emphasized international law, sovereignty, and dialogue. Privately, according to diplomatic reporting, there was concern about precedent. If one alliance member openly pushes another over territory, even without force, what does that normalize for the future? This question matters far beyond Greenland. It touches on how disputes are framed, how pressure is applied, and how unity is maintained in a changing global order. And that's why this speech is still being analyzed line by line. Trump repeatedly framed the United States as the engine keeping the global system running. He argued that without U.S. leadership, many systems would struggle to function. He criticized European dependence on American defense support, and he positioned U.S. demands as logical outcomes of that imbalance. At the same time, he emphasized shared culture, shared history, and shared success between the U.S. and Europe. Those two narratives, partnership and pressure, coexist uneasily, and Greenland sits right in the middle of that contradiction. After more than an hour on stage, Trump left without announcing any concrete next steps. No timeline, no framework, no confirmed talks. But in global politics, statements at Davos rarely end stories. They start them. Since the speech, discussions within NATO, the EU, and national governments have reportedly intensified, not about Greenland alone, but about how future disagreements will be handled. Because if this moment taught leaders anything, it's that assumptions about alignment can no longer go unexamined. On paper, NATO is a military alliance. In practice, it's also a system of expectations. Who protects whom? Who pays how much? Who decides what is strategic? And that's why Trump's comments about Greenland landed differently inside NATO than they did in public headlines. Greenland is part of the Kingdom of Denmark, a NATO member. The United States already maintains a military presence there. There is no immediate security gap that needs to be filled. So when Trump framed Greenland as unsecured and emphasized that NATO should not stand in the way, the concern wasn't about today, it was about tomorrow. Because if strategic necessity is defined unilaterally, alliance coordination becomes optional, not foundational. That's a red line NATO has spent decades trying to avoid crossing. For years, the Arctic was treated as peripheral, cold, remote, expensive. That is no longer the case. As ice coverage changes, new shipping routes become viable. As technology advances, monitoring and defense systems become more precise. And as global competition intensifies, Geography regains importance. Publicly available defense assessments consistently identify the Arctic as one of the next major strategic theaters. Greenland sits at the center of that reality. Which means this conversation was never really about Denmark. It was about positioning. Here's where the speech becomes especially interesting. Trump didn't just imply he wouldn't use force. He repeated it. I don't want to use force. I won't use force. That repetition wasn't accidental. In political communication, repeating a denial often signals awareness of a concern that already exists. In this case, the concern wasn't military action tomorrow. It was reputational impact today. By ruling out force so clearly, Trump effectively reframed the discussion from coercion to negotiation, even while applying pressure through rhetoric. That dual approach allows multiple interpretations at once, and that ambiguity is part of the strategy. While force was explicitly rejected, economic and political leverage remained very much on the table. Throughout the Davos appearance, Trump emphasized tariffs, trade imbalances, and U.S. economic dominance. He reminded the audience that access to American markets is not guaranteed. He highlighted past examples where pressure led to concessions. And he framed economic strength as a tool for shaping outcomes. None of this was directly linked to Greenland. But context matters. When discussions of territory, trade, and alliance responsibility happen in the same speech, listeners connect the dots, even if no line is explicitly drawn. That's why European leaders reacted cautiously rather than confrontationally. They understood the language being used. Denmark's public stance has focused on sovereignty, dialogue, and international law. No escalation, no personal attacks, no dramatic counterstatements. That restraint is intentional, because overreaction would elevate the issue. Underreaction would normalize it. So, Denmark, like many allies, has chosen a third path. Acknowledge the comments, reaffirm principles, and shift the conversation back to process. Behind the scenes, however, the implications are being studied carefully, not just in Copenhagen, but across Europe. For analysts following U.S. foreign policy, the Greenland remarks fit into a larger pattern, a preference for bilateral leverage over multilateral consensus, a focus on tangible assets over abstract commitments, and a willingness to challenge long-standing assumptions publicly. This doesn't automatically signal instability, but it does signal change. And change, even when nonviolent, creates friction. You don't need to care about Greenland to understand why this matters, because the real issue isn't geography, it's precedent. If major powers begin framing alliance relationships as transactional rather than mutual, the entire architecture of post-war cooperation shifts. That affects trade agreements, defense planning, diplomatic trust, and those effects ripple far beyond one island in the Arctic. Trump did not outline a legal mechanism for acquiring Greenland. He did not specify Denmark's consent. He did not reference Greenland's own autonomy or local governance in detail. Those omissions matter, because they leave space that diplomats, lawyers, and strategists now have to fill. And when space exists in international politics, uncertainty grows. Davos is where political signals are translated into risk models. When leaders hear words like immediate negotiations, strategic necessity, and we will remember, they don't hear ideology. They hear variables. Variables that affect defense spending, infrastructure investment, energy strategy, Arctic logistics. That's why this moment is being discussed not just in foreign ministries, but in boardrooms. Ironically, Trump's remarks may have achieved something unintended. They pushed European leaders to re-examine their own Arctic strategy. Questions that had been secondary are now front and center. How much should Europe invest in Arctic security? How united is the EU on territorial and strategic questions? How should allies respond when pressure is rhetorical, not military? These are long-term questions, and they don't have quick answers. At this point, a critical distinction becomes clear. Greenland may not be the end goal. It may be the signal, a way of testing how allies respond to direct pressure, a way of gauging resistance versus accommodation, a way of redefining what negotiation looks like in the current era. If that's the case, then the real implications of this speech are still ahead of us. What could realistically happen next? Despite the intensity of the headlines, there is an important reality to acknowledge. There is no simple or fast pathway for the United States to acquire Greenland. Any change in Greenland's status would require Denmark's consent, legal and constitutional processes, consideration of Greenland's autonomous government, broad international acceptance. That makes sudden outcomes unlikely. But diplomacy rarely moves in straight lines. Instead, it advances through signals, test cases, and gradual pressure, and that's where the story continues. The most likely short-term outcome is extended dialogue, not negotiations over ownership, but discussions around security cooperation, infrastructure investment, expanded U.S. presence, Arctic coordination within NATO. In this scenario, Greenland remains Danish, but U.S. influence increases incrementally. This allows all sides to claim stability while quietly adjusting realities on the ground. For many analysts, this is the path of least resistance. Another possibility is coordinated resistance. European leaders may decide that allowing this framing to stand, even rhetorically, sets an uncomfortable precedent. If that happens, expect stronger emphasis on sovereignty, clearer NATO statements, unified EU messaging, not as confrontation, but as clarification. This would be less about opposing the US and more about reinforcing the rules that have governed alliances for decades. There is also a third option, and it's often overlooked. The world moves on. Global crises, economic shifts, or new security concerns could push Greenland back into the background. If that happens, this speech will be remembered not for what it changed, but for what it revealed about style, tone, and strategic thinking. In geopolitics, attention is a resource, and it is always contested. Even if Greenland remains exactly where it is, this moment has already done its work. It forced allies to reassess assumptions. It reframed how pressure can be applied without force. And it demonstrated how rhetoric alone can shift strategic conversations. That's influence, even without outcomes. One detail often missing from the debate is Greenland's own voice. Greenland is a self-governing territory with its own political institutions and public opinion. Any future discussion about its status would have to involve Greenlanders directly. That reality complicates every simplified narrative and serves as a reminder that this isn't just a chessboard for larger powers. It's a place where people live, work, and govern themselves. Of all the statements made in Davos, the repeated rejection of force may end up being the most consequential. Not because it lowers tension today, but because it establishes a boundary. It signals that whatever comes next will happen through persuasion, leverage, and negotiation, not coercion. That distinction matters deeply in international norms, and it will shape how this episode is referenced in the future. This story is ultimately about how power is changing, not disappearing. Not becoming weaker, but becoming more openly transactional. When leaders speak this way on global stages, they normalize a new tone, one that blends diplomacy, pressure, and performance. Whether that strengthens or strains alliances depends on how others respond, and those responses are still forming. The question now isn't whether the U.S. will acquire Greenland. The question is whether alliances can adapt to this style of negotiation, or whether they will push back to preserve older rules. That answer won't come in a single announcement. It will emerge gradually, through choices that seem small at first. What happened in Davos wasn't a conclusion. It was a signal. A signal about how negotiations may look going forward. A signal about how influence is framed without force. And a signal that even long-settled assumptions can be reopened if the moment is right. In the next video, we'll take this one step further and look at how Arctic geopolitics, NATO priorities, and global competition are converging, and why this region may play a much bigger role in the coming years than most people expect.